All right. So we're ready to go. And of course we gather, we join each other today on the third anniversary of the January 6th invasion of the Capitol that coincided with the meeting of the Electoral College to register the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, an election which Donald Trump lost, Joe Biden won, and yet throughout the period from the first Tuesday in November through January 6, 2021, Donald Trump maintained that he had won the election was being stolen from him, that it was only through fraud and malfeasance that the election was being awarded to his opponent. And then after he brought numerous suits, over 60 of them, asked for audits, etc., no evidence was in fact found to be credible, that there was the kind of fraud that would be determinative of the outcomes of the election. Very, very, very few cases of fraud whatsoever, none of them significant enough to change the outcome. Donald Trump invited a crowd to Washington and implored them to go to the Capitol, and they then invaded the Capitol. Right, and as we know, Donald Trump is now in considerable legal jeopardy as a result of this, and yet at the same time, he remains the prohibitive frontrunner for the nomination for the Republican Party for the presidency this year, 2024. And so we have, in ways that I've described, the messy collision of the legal and the political process playing out in real time in front of our eyes. And I want to start with one aspect of this. And so in the January 6th federal case, right, the case that is currently scheduled, slated to begin in early March, although Donald Trump's legal team has appealed the idea that he can be prosecuted on the basis of a broad or complete claim to presidential immunity, nothing that he can do while serving in his capacity as the president of the United States can be held to be grounds for criminal liability. And what he did in and around the effort to allegedly overturn the election was in his capacity as president, and therefore he is immune against prosecution. That will have to be determined ultimately by the Supreme Court of the United States before that trial can proceed. Having said all of that, by way of background, I now want to emphasize one thing which I think is a little strange and at the same time, in fact, deeply illuminating of the moment in which we live, which is that in response to the prosecution, the multi-count indictment brought against Donald Trump's legal team has made discovery motions. This is a relatively standard procedure in criminal and civil cases. They want to know what they want to know in order to defend their uh, client, in this case, the former president. And among the things they are asking, however, is what evidence does the prosecutor, does the federal government, does the FBI, does the CIA have of the fact that in various left-wing groups or foreign agents or progressive journalists, in fact, either invaded the Capitol, Antifa, for instance, or else urged and, in a sense, tricked the president's supporters into invading the Capitol in order to discredit Donald Trump and to make it appear as if he was behind an insurrection. And to be as clear as possible, what they're asking essentially is, are these cooked up, kooky disinformation conspiracy theories that are circulating on the web by Trump supporters, in fact, true? And I think what will obviously be the case is not only will there be no discoverable evidence for these theories, but that they will be summarily dismissed by the courts, and the fact that they are in Trump's discovery papers will damage his credibility in the eyes of the court. He is defending himself not directly and via the ordinary channels available to him, but by appealing to exactly the same kind of disinformation that led to the invasion of the Capitol in the first place. And so there's no indication of remorse, quite the contrary, a doubling down on the very strategy that the government is attempting to hold him culpable for. Why would any attorney do this? And I think part of the answer, of course, is because their client is Donald Trump, and because Donald Trump has a very problematic relationship with reality and truth, and as opposed to that, attempts to bend every situation to his advantage. And so he's using the very fact that he's on trial as another opportunity to spread disinformation. But having said that, I think there's a deeper and more important truth that this reveals, which is that in 2024, in the current historical moment, there are so many opportunities for disinformation to be spread, for it to gain credence, for a critical mass of belief and support to congeal around lies and disinformation, that they become credible and become the basis for an alternative sense of reality on the part of wide swaths of our public, right? And so this is not merely a delusionary tactic. This is a tactic that has a clear and potentially successful strategic architecture underpinning it. And the strategy here is to win the election by running against the prosecution, labeling it persecution, and building an alternative basis of facts with which to dismiss it, but not only dismiss it, convert it into evidence that Donald Trump is the one true advocate of so many disillusioned Americans, and that if he is not reelected, they will be permanently disregarded by mainstream American institutions. He is instrumentalizing the legal process for political aims, and it may be that the best defense Donald Trump has is to be reelected president, to then immediately have the Justice Department drop these charges, to use then presidential immunity to try to avoid the prosecution at the state level in Georgia and Manhattan. And he could very well succeed. So this may be a case of crazy like a fox. And I think this is a really good way into the fundamental issues that are facing us as we approach the new presidential elections and reflect on the third anniversary of January 6th. I want to come at this one more direction at the very beginning, and that is to say that there has been a long-standing hope among people like me, and I suspect many of you, that this moment in our political history, and it's become more than a moment, it's a chapter, it's an episode, would end. And that it would end because people would come to their senses, because at some point the accrual of evidence, the long term effects of Trump's denial of reality, combined with his um, growing list of bad behavior, bad rhetoric, increasingly authoritarian use of vocabulary and calls for policy would succeed in discrediting Trump. And that in a sense, this is all about Trump, that if we can rid ourselves of Trump, if we can put him in jail before he gets reelected, if he loses the next election, finally the fever will break and America will come to its senses. And I have to say, I am of two minds about that proposition. On the one hand, I do think that Donald Trump is a unique political figure, uniquely charismatic, and unique in his willingness to take advantage of the post-truth political moment, of the epistemic anarchy of our current public sphere, and to use it without restraint to promote his own power and success. And that exactly the fact that he is rudderless, that he has no moral compass, that he seems willing to do anything and everything that is required to promote himself and his power, are both the key to his success and part of his appeal as a political leader. And frankly, it takes a certain kind of person to campaign, to present themselves in public in that way, to not feel the bite of conscience when they do so. And perhaps when Donald Trump is no longer on the political scene, there won't be anyone capable of the kind of politics that he has mastered, and a kind of politics that now has completely taken over one of our two main political parties and therefore presents a quite perilous threat to our democracy. So that would be the fever will break. We will come to our senses position. The alternative position, and it's the one I want to explore today, is that although Donald Trump may be uniquely qualified and capable of taking advantage of the epistemic anarchy and of articulating the grievance, the indignation, the anger, of converting the anxiety of the large portion of Americans who feel left out of the distribution of income, wealth, opportunity, recognition, and dignity in the third decade of the 21st century, that he converts their anxiety into anger targeted at a identifiable scapegoat or scapegoats, the immigrants, the elites, the liberals, and that is unique to him. But he is tapping into both objective aspects of our current historical, social, political, cultural moment, the transformation of our public sphere by digital media, the growing inequality, the growing diversity, the move into a post-traditional culture that will live on even after he is no longer on the political scene, and that therefore the stage will be ripe for someone like him to replace Donald Trump once Donald Trump is gone. That there are deeper structural forces at work here. This is not all about the personality of this one individual. And that's, in a sense, the main proposition I want to pursue today. I want to look at this anniversary from one final perspective, and that is from the perspective of the legal challenges facing Donald Trump as he faces four criminal trials, as a civil trial that now threatens to perhaps levy fines that could take a third or more of Donald Trump's wealth, that could dissolve his business empire in New York as that trial enters its decisive penalty phase. And so our court system is moving. And as we say, the wheels of justice turn slowly. It is taking its time, probably as it should. Evidence had to be accumulated, theories had to be considered, and then Donald Trump, of course, has the rights, the procedural rights available to him as a defendant under a system governed by the rule of law. The question is, will we have a collision between our legal system and our political system this year as Donald Trump potentially faces conviction, and at the same time as the Republican Party seems to be almost inevitably nominating him as its presidential candidate. So those are the themes I want to use the anniversary as a excuse or an occasion, I guess I should say, to discuss. And I'll talk about a question we spoke about last week for just a second. Is the era of modern liberal democracy ending? And I used Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat as authors to frame that question. As I have done in the past, I could put a whole spread, 20 or 30 books, all devoted to this question on a slide if I wanted to. The evidence seems to be quite clear. We are in an era that political scientists refer to as an era of democratic recession or democratic backsliding. The number of countries that are democratizing is shrinking precipitously. The drift in the direction of autocracy is appreciable throughout the democratic world. The portion of the world's population that lives in secure liberal democracies is diminishing throughout the 21st century. The portion of the world's population that does not have the rights secured by liberal democracy has more than doubled this century. This is perilous times for democracy, and that is certainly the case in the United States. I emphasized to you last week that there are considerable problems with three main pillars of democracy in the world today. With our public sphere and our media systems, that's where I will concentrate a fair bit of energy today. With the capacity of elections to serve to effectively channel the demand on the part of ordinary people that their ideas, their interests, their preferences, their needs and aspirations shape the political agenda of their country. The evidence is quite clear. We are moving very much in the direction of plutocracy or oligarchy, where democratic institutions are effectively captured by a narrow and very wealthy elite. This is especially evident in the United States, but true throughout much of the democratic world. And people are understandably angry. And then we add that the conservative parties of the world seem to be better poised to articulate the anger, the grievance about both the unresponsiveness of democratic institutions and the inequality and the unfairness of it, the growing precariousness of large portions of democratic populations, that they in particular answer to the need to offer a simple explanation that identifies a culprit. They blame immigrants, they blame minorities, they sometimes blame Jews, they blame the liberal cosmopolitan elite, and that this is an easier card for them to play than the left populist card is for liberal, democratic, progressive left parties to play. And by the way, the right is increasingly willing to use the tools of social media dissemination of disinformation. And the result is that conservative parties are, on the one hand, finding electoral success in this new environment, on the other hand, increasingly being transformed into populist, autocratic, anti institutionalist parties and having trouble often controlling the forces they unleash. I would suggest that's very much true of the Republican Party. And I would just point out if we look at the 20-year period from 2004 to 2024, the Republican Party is unrecognizable from where it was under George W. Bush to where it is today under Donald Trump, Mike Johnson, Make America Great Again, um, uh, Republicans. And this is a fundamental problem for democratic societies, and especially for the United States as we enter an election season. Having said that, today I really want to focus on the transformation of the public sphere. And so, as you had seen, I had put Jürgen Habermas's work on the board. This is really the seminal text on the public sphere as a key institution to democracy. And what Habermas points out, German social theorist, still alive, still writing well into his 90s, is that the coming into being of a literary public sphere, a public sphere in which most people read, and in particular read newspapers, made it possible to conceive of the public as the main actor in politics. People were forming opinions simultaneously about the same thing. When you think about Greek or Roman democracy, the origin of this idea, this form of politics, there people came together in a single space to discuss politics and to form public opinion and ultimately to vote. Once you had societies that had millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people in it, how was there ever going to be public opinion, public will? Democracy lacked its core agent, and then the newspapers and the coming into being of a literary public sphere allowed for the simultaneous participation in dialogue, in deliberation by a mass public. Everybody's reading the same thing. Everybody can discuss the same thing at the same time, even if the public is no longer organized in a single concrete space. Nevertheless, public opinion is capable of coalescing around shared ideas being distributed by mass media, in this case, newspapers. And so the literary public sphere is, in a sense, the origins of modern democracy, and in its content, in its mode of operation, it encourages a certain kind of public opinion formation premised on reading together the same thing at the same time, on slowly processing what you read, on forming an opinion about it, on discussing that opinion with others. And the result is that it appeared to be what Habermas calls a rational critical public, a public that made up its mind on the basis of the public use of reason, that formed ideas that were critical of the monarchy, the aristocracy, that involved saying, what is justifiable in this historical moment? I will very briefly take you back to some ideas we've talked about together before, which is that we are no longer in the age of the literary public sphere. We are much more in a digital public sphere, and that our public sphere has been deeply transformed. I'm going to spend a little bit of time with work by O'Connor and Weatherall on the misinformation age, how false beliefs spread, Working in the Background, The Paradox of Democracy by Gershberg and Illing, but especially on network propaganda by Bankler, Ferris, and Roberts. And so let me start with a little bit of information from O'Connor and Weatherall. And this is just a basic model for how opinion is transmitted in networks, right? Who talks to whom? And so you can have different structures. And I would point out that there is a distinction here between complete, right, networking in which every person is talking to every person in this relatively small group of people, or a star in which there's only one person connecting everyone, or clumpy, right, groupings or networks in which a number of people are talking among themselves, but rarely talking to another group of people. And what O'Connor and Weatherall point out is that if, and they're philosophers of science, if you're interested in how false beliefs are eventually displaced by true beliefs, you need to be attentive to how the beliefs circulate in a network. And so this is an illustration of the majority of people in a network believing something that is false, a couple people beginning to circulate alternative and it turns out valid belief, and how, because they're all networked, slowly but surely they convince everyone else of the true belief, to the point where everyone in the network comes to have high confidence in the true belief. And so one of the questions we have to ask as we think about these issues is, what are the networks of belief formation and knowledge transmission that our media system, which is a digital media system, creates, opens up for us in the 21st century? And here I will point out very quickly that we are in the midst of a profound and profoundly fast media transformation. Please note that at the beginning of this century, nobody was using social media technology because social media technology did not exist. That slowly but surely this technology comes online. Many people think of 2012 as being the big inflection point. And please note, at the time this diagram is accumulated, which is 2019, we have 2 billion people using Facebook, almost that many using YouTube, over a billion using WhatsApp and Instagram, and TikTok is just barely uh, it, penetrating here. Twitter has not yet taken off. Things like Pinterest, which were beginning to take off, seem to have stalled out. But all this to say, right, very quickly, these new media for the dissemination of ideas, for the communication with each other of opinions, have gone from non-existent to prevalent, right? And it is the case that the majority of Americans now get their principal news information from social media, not from old or new broadcast media, not from the quaint, antiquated form of newspapers, which I imagine many of us still rely on today, right? We are dinosaurs. At least we are not representative of the trends in our society. So the number of people using these social media has gone up dramatically. That's just another way of looking at the end point of that previous diagram. And the number of hours being spent with this media. Please note, this is all pre-pandemic information. This, no doubt, is is still much greater today. I don't have the updated information, but by 2018, right, people in the United States on average were spending 6 hours a day with digital media, and a large portion of that time with social media. And so I just, this is review. This should be relatively straightforward. We now have a digital public sphere. It is a new beast. It is a profound transformation in the way we communicate with each other, the way our knowledge is shaped, the way our opinions are formed. And it pains me to say that Donald Trump really understood this and the potentials that it opened politically much earlier, much more thoroughly, much more opportunistically than really anybody else in his historical moment. So, what is our public sphere like today? And I want to suggest it is very different from that literary public sphere in which our representative form of constitutional democracy took shape. It is a digital internet. The public is fragmented. We're each occupying narrow niches of information transmission, and we are distracted. The average time spent on a social media post is less than 20 seconds and shrinking, right? Twitter for a long time had a maximum number of characters. TikTok, which is the new viral social media, maybe not so new anymore, prefers posts that are 5 seconds or less. It is everywhere, right? We're not just reading the newspaper in the quiet of the study or the breakfast table. We are tuning in as we're driving down the road, walking down the street, in the line at the grocery store, not spaces for quiet reflection, right? And what we have now is constant connectivity and this constant possibility for the contagion of information. It is structured by commercial algorithms, right? That prioritize posts, forms of media communication that hold our attention, because that's the core business model here, both to be able to keep our eyes on the screen to show us advertising, and also to be able to collect as much data as possible about us. And the result is that there's been a complete marginalization of the reliability, the verifiability, the validity of the content being transmitted. All that matters is that it holds attention, not whether it's true or false. This is primarily a media system without verification, without filter, without the gatekeeping functions that the old mass media used. And it is narrowcast and broadcast simultaneously. We're about to get into this. Narrowcast meaning only you or people like you see the stuff on your social media feed. Broadcast meaning we still have large circulation media, but even those large circulation media are no longer trying to reach a general audience. They're trying to reach a large niche audience. I imagine most of us don't regularly watch Fox News, and we don't because we find it repellent and repugnant. They're not trying to reach us. Their model, their commercial model, relies on the fact that there are people who are so identified with Fox News that that is the only news source that they will watch, and that what is advertised on Fox News becomes for them almost a marker of their political identity because it's advertised on Fox News. So that Fox News is broadcasting, but it's reaching only a specific segment of the public, and that's the new business model. So, elaborating this a little bit, now going back to Bankler, Ferris, and Roberts, there's an old school model of how the media is supposed to work, are supposed to work in a democracy, in which, on the one hand, you have a public that is seeking two things, right? Truth or knowledge or information, something that helps them to understand their world and to form their public opinions. But they're also seeking what is called identity confirming news. You want to believe that you are in the right, that people like you are good and just and smart. And it's sometimes hard to have to digest inconvenient truth. And so we would prefer, if we can, to find news sources that suggest most everything we believe is right and that people like us are the good kind of people. Those two things compete with each other. And because there's a competition within the media, but over the question of whether they're delivering the truth, and because media outlets that simply cater to identity confirmation get discredited by their peers, the media does not simply play an identity confirming role, but instead has to verify before it reports. And of course, the third group here is politicians who are seeking favorable news coverage. But in order to get favorable news coverage from a media that is critical and sensitive to the validity of what it reports, the politicians are disciplined to verify their positions, or at least to limit themselves to factually plausible bases for the policies they advocate. This is the alternative, transformed model for media production. And as you can see, the three actors are still the same: the media, the public, and the politicians. What has changed is that the media are no longer policing themselves for the validity or verifiability of what they report. As opposed to that, they are policing themselves for identity confirmation, where deviance from identity confirmation is punished by other media outlets. So if Fox News declares Biden to be the winner of the 2020 election based on its polling data in Arizona, Newsmax immediately criticizes Fox News, and Fox News starts to lose viewership until it comes back round to reporting favorably on Trump, even if what Trump is saying is obviously false and unverifiable. It will lose its media share if it verifies its information and only supports the truth. The public then gets confirmed in its identity without having to swallow inconvenient truths and adjust those aspects of its identity that are no longer aligned with what reality requires. Politicians, again, can simply seek favorable coverage by confirming the identity of the public. And this is a new model for the production of the news, and it's a model that only takes hold in a digital public sphere. The combination of social media and narrow casting instead of three stations competing for a general audience, hundreds of stations each competing for a niche audience, makes this new model commercially not only viable, but highly profitable in the 21st century. And so then when we look in particular at where media disinformation comes from, the vast majority of it comes from direct browsing, from stuff that people get online, search engines, social media, right? It does not come from the mainstream newspapers. Now, this is a little hard to discern, but this is the work that Bankler and his colleagues did that really I think is incredibly valuable. And what this shows is the way in which the digital public sphere is networked, and it shows density of connections. And when you drill down on this, it really seems to reveal a bifurcated or fractured public sphere in which there's much greater connectivity between the media of the left and the mainstream conservative media on the one hand, right? So dense lines connecting all of them, and a second media public sphere, not very well connected to the first, that is on the right and especially on the far right, and that seems to be influenced by far right internet sources like, for instance, Breitbart. And this is then reflected also in the kind of media that people pay attention to. This shows what's called a bimodal distribution, right? There's one center here. So in the left and center public sphere, primary attention focuses on relatively moderate sources. But on the right, the second mode, the attention goes up the further out you get, the more ideologically extreme you become. Right on the left, the way out there news sources, your Mother Jones, your Nation, etc., New Left Review are not getting a lot of attention. But on the right, the bright parts, the Newsmax, are getting a lot of the attention, and that's pulling all of the other outlets in that direction to compete. Again, if we look at where false news circulates, what we see is that the prevalence of disinformation on Fox News is 50% higher than it is on MSNBC, more than twice as high as it is on CNN. And then, by the way, if we ask where is the false news coming from on CNN or ABC, we see it's coming almost exclusively from conservatives. And that's an overstatement. I want to correct that. It's coming predominantly from conservative sources. And of course, on Fox News, it is coming almost exclusively from conservative sources. And so this emergence of a discrete right wing media system and public sphere has flooded the United States with disinformation. Why is Donald Trump putting conspiracy theory ideas into his legal briefs? Because not that he hopes to convince a court. The court has its evidentiary standards. It's going to dismiss this out of hand once no evidence can be produced for it, but because he knows it will circulate on Fox News, because it will circulate in the right wing media system, and it will shape the views of his supporters in addressing one of his clear vulnerabilities, because it is clear in opinion poll after opinion poll, if Donald Trump is thought to have motivated the assault on the Capitol in order to overturn the election of 2020, he loses support. But if he can shape public opinion to suggest that that's not what happened, that the facts are different from what we know them to be, and if he can gain the allegiance of powerful media outlets in helping him to do that work, then he has a reasonable chance of being the next president of the United States and escaping all of the legal vulnerability that is building up. Now, so far, I've paid attention to the media and to Donald Trump, to relatively elite institutions. I want to focus for a moment on a different idea, and that is how it is that a substantial portion of the American population has come to be susceptible to this kind of manipulation and disinformation. And I think that's equally urgent to understand. And here I'm going to draw on the work, as I have in the past, of Sophia Rosenfeld, and who in turn draws on Hannah Arendt's work, and starting with the idea that truth and politics obey distinct logics, that truth, in terms of historical, social, scientific truth, is mm, um, an enterprise for scholars, for experts, that most of us don't form our own beliefs directly by doing the research ourselves. There is not world and time enough for doing that, given how complex our news is. We rely on media, on news outlets, on books and information generated by those experts. And so we are susceptible to influence and potentially disinformation. This seems to be the very nature of truth. And so, how reliable one's knowledge is depends in part on how reliable what you might call the knowledge system of your society is. Politics, on the other hand, is about opinion formation. How do we assemble a majority? How do we put together the coalition that is going to allow us to win the next election? And in particular, the question of how much we are willing to, in our efforts to form that successful coalition, let what we say be constrained or confined or shaped by what experts tell us the truth is, has been highly variable throughout history. And the question here is in part, when and why does elite or technocratic determination of the truth produce a populist backlash, a so-called know nothing movement, in which we say we don't care what the experts say, they're biased, they're prejudiced, they're self-serving, they're not governed by expertise sensitive to the truth, as opposed to that they are merely dressing up their interests as if truth was on their side. And so if we start looking more systematically at what I'm going to call the expertise and knowledge system, the EKR, we can see that it becomes uh, subject to popular suspicion when it appears there's a bias in favor of certain and against other views that permeates that system. It becomes subject to popular suspicion when it appears that access to the expertise and knowledge system is corrupted by wealth and power. And so, right, if we begin to believe that the only people who become experts are the children of the already privileged, that there's a kind of nepotism that serves as a gatekeeper to this. If that's because in order to become an expert, you need to get an advanced degree from a prestigious institution, and our access to prestigious institutions is extremely expensive, such that only those with a lot of wealth can afford to gain access, then we begin to think not only is it unfair, but in fact it is corrupt, that the expertise and knowledge system speaks with an upper class bias, reflects upper class interests and experience, and neglects, disrespects other experiences, other ideas. There's also right, a kind of suspicion when the intellectual qualifications seem to serve as markers of privilege, right? Where your ability to master a certain kind of knowledge gains you access to spaces of privilege, to unfairly distributed opportunities in your society. And in these circumstances, greater value may be placed on a certain kind of authenticity than truth or expertise. And I think this is very clear when we look especially at Trump versus Clinton. Clinton had all of the qualifications, but appeared to be inauthentic. And it turned out that people, well, at least a broad swath of the American public, preferred authenticity. Um, there is also often tension between common sense and expert knowledge. And this depends in part on the degree to which authoritative knowledge and common sense converge or diverge. And so when we face a pandemic, how likely does it seem to be that masking or social distancing protect us? And if we don't have any common sense experience that confirms that, we may be suspicious of expertise. When experts are telling us we have to diminish our use of carbon based fuel because of something called climate change, but there doesn't seem to be any real evidence of it, common sense pushes us in a direction different from expertise. And we add to that how complex is the world we're trying to understand. If it becomes too complex, if there's simply too much to learn, if there's too much expertise required, if I'm trying to understand artificial intelligence, climate change, globalization, pandemics, immigration, all at the same time, I may feel overburdened and I may desire some kind of simplifying narrative. And by the way, a conspiracy theory often offers that level of simplicity. And then finally, the degree to which the truth is inconvenient or disagreeable. Does it suggest we have to change things that we value and like and that are important to us, maybe even surrender certain advantages? Um, and so with all of this in mind, and I think I'm going to skip this last point in the name of time. I want to now point to what I think is perhaps most distinctive about Donald Trump in American history. And that is what I'm going to call his post-truth stance. That he says essentially that experts are wrong, that they shouldn't be listened to, that they are fake, that there is no real expertise. This is what makes him post-truth, this embrace of epistemic anarchy, of the sense that everything is ultimately about interest, and then that he provides a personal, charismatic alternative. Don't listen to them, listen to me. I know. I have mastered the business world, the world of reality television, and now the world of politics. And by the way, I don't try to master this incredibly complex information. I'm not one of those pointy headed experts. I have gut instincts just like you, and my gut instincts will get us to better policies. Prioritizing will over understanding, right? What matters more is that we strongly impose our interests on the world than that we try to understand the world. And valuing power and authority over knowledge and verifiability and making the truth. We may not like what those experts tell us, that there's a history of racial injustice in our society and that we don't deserve everything we have. So let us make a different truth through our power and our will. And so this then I think takes us to the question of what mechanisms of accountability are left to us. And obviously, the courts, in terms of civil judgments, have been able to hold some actors and people accountable, right? And so the Fox News network, the most important conduit for disinformation in the United States, has paid a verdict of over $700 million to the Dominion Company. It's now facing another lawsuit. Rudy Giuliani, not that he will pay anything like this amount, but has been held liable for nearly $150 million in a defamation suit, right? And so our courts are increasingly the arbiters of what is truth and false, but do they succeed in convincing people, and in particular in convincing us as we approach a vote? And my suggestion is, not so long as the Republican Party remains a bullhorn for disinformation. So not in the Trump era. And the party of 2024 really is a different party. Its support has been realigned. It's become an ethno-racial, populist, increasingly authoritarian party. And among its attributes is its unwillingness to accept unfavorable election results and accountability for violating democratic norms. Is the outcome of 2020 what it appears to be? No, according to half of the officials running for national office under the Republican Party auspices in 2022. And by the way, the other quarter who are not denying the outcome of the election are not having any opinion on it. It's a very small minority of Republican candidates who are willing to say, actually, 2020 was correctly decided, and Republican voters are following suit. 70% of them suspect fraud. Similarly, the majority of elected officials in Congress in the Republican Party deny that Trump did anything wrong in retaining the classified documents that he took with him to Mar-a-Lago in clear violation of some important national security law, or in the buildup to the January 6th riot. And again, 56% of Republicans suggest that Trump is only being prosecuted because he defends people like you, not because he did anything wrong. And so we will have to turn to the courts again to arbitrate this. And again, I want to suggest, as we look at the question, can Donald Trump even appear on the ballot? Currently being litigated in 17 states and about to be heard by the Supreme Court next month. Is the president immune from prosecution from anything he does in his capacity as the president? And was Donald Trump acting in that capacity when he attacked the elections of 2020 and ultimately played a role in first motivating people to go to the Congress and then not using the powers of the presidency to rapidly disperse the crowds who invaded Congress? And I just want to say as clearly as possible, there are multiple outcomes here. And I think we have to just recognize how diverse they are and how tricky they are. One outcome would be that the Supreme Court bars Donald Trump from being the presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 2024. And I want to say, I don't think that that's a totally impossible outcome. I think there are actually some pretty good arguments that are that of a kind that are likely to persuade the conservative jurists on the court that the right way to read the 14th Amendment is as banning those who swore allegiance to the Constitution and then either engaged in or supported an insurrection from serving again in federal office, right? That's the core case here. Now, having said that, please note the tremendous collision between the rule of law and the Constitution and the democratic process that that generates, right? 40% of Americans, according to polls, seem to want Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States. And 9 unelected people are going to tell us that we can't have our preferred candidate. That is bound to do tremendous damage to the Supreme Court and present just incredibly difficult to reconcile tensions between the rule of law and democracy in the United States. That's one possible outcome. Second possible outcome is that Donald Trump is allowed to run, remains on the ballot, and that through various legal procedures, he delays all of his trials until after November 2024, and that he is elected president of the United States. And through his election, he avoids prosecution. So we never know what the outcome of those trials would be. And he is in fact empowered again to exercise all of that power vested in the presidency of the United States. Again, I want to suggest this is perhaps an even worse outcome for American democracy. It seems to me the outcome we have to hope for is that the Supreme Court expeditiously resolves both the question of Trump's eligibility and the question of his immunity, that those trials then get underway quickly, and that the American people see the outcome of a trial of the former president by a jury of his peers before the election occurs. And I'm not taking a stance on what the outcome of those trials will be. Donald Trump is entitled to be presumed innocent until those trials are conducted. But the American people are entitled to know what the outcome of those trials are. This is our best hope for restoring some sense of common reality. And it won't be unanimity, far from it. But I do think that there are a significant portion of the Trump voters who seem to say, if a jury of Trump's peers say he illegally retained classified documents, and especially if they say he conspired to overturn the results of the election, they will no longer support him. So this is the tricky moment we find ourselves in as we reflect back on the 3rd anniversary of January 6th. It seems far from exercising this demon. Our current politics are still haunted, still bedeviled by what happened on January 6th, by our incapacity to establish a common truth between us, by our need to rely simultaneously on courts and elections to determine what is going to happen for the future of our democracy. I'll stop there. I imagine you guys must have thoughts, questions, concerns. Who wants to start us out? Flossie, unmute yourself, please. No, you're still muted, Flossie. You got to hold that space bar down. Sorry.
Right.
There you
Now,
go.
can you hear me?
Yes.
I think we have to go back to rereading Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. Do you recall the essay?
It's been a long
Iris
time. Why don't you
responding,
refresh our
and he
memory?
said, "Oh, would you let me finish, please?"
Yes.
He proposes that since the Irish were starving, there was no way to take care of their hunger except to let them have babies and to use the babies as food if they were well prepared, like roasted pigs or hens. He did that, and it worked. Also, I bemoan the passing of Philip Roth, who wrote American Pastoral, another look at American politics and stupidity and some hope for the future. I think we need literature to laugh and to make us look ridiculous. Trump hasn't been spoofed enough. He hasn't been ridiculed enough. He needs to be ridiculed by the experts.
And so satire as our best.
One weapon, but it has to be in the hands of a master like Swift or Philip Roth.
And I will just point out very quickly, we might add Charlie Chaplin, right, to this list of extremely gifted satirists, right, and he did it not through literature but through silent films. And yet, despite the brilliance of Chaplin's satirical presentation of Hitler, it didn't stop Hitler in his tracks, right? And so when does political satire work? I think the best we may have in 2024 will be the likes of Saturday Night Live in terms of reaching a mass audience, right? I mean, this goes back to something I was discussing with you. Swift wrote at a moment when he didn't have to compete with TikTok, right? And so people read Swift in part because there was no dumbed down alternative. And I just worry that the kind of literary satire that you're describing remains attractive to people who have been trained in it and enjoy it, but they're not the people who we actually need to reach if we're going to expose how not only dangerous, but in basic respects, risible Donald Trump is, right? Barbara, you have your hand up. Go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself.
George Orwell. We need another Orwell.
Yeah, I'm in Barbara's chair.
Go ahead.
And apropos of this discussion that Fossey introduced, last night we did watch The Great Dictator, the 41 Chaplin film, 40, I guess, Chaplin film. And you can see the satire there. But the other thing I wanted to say was that it is true that the right has a really good narrative, and the idea of common sense and the narrative of giving our heritage and our birthright to other folks who don't deserve it because they haven't worked as hard as we have. Those are powerful narratives. But I would remind us all that we did have powerful narratives on the left that supported the factual information that we had available to make important political movements in the 30s and again in the 50s, and I would argue maybe not quite as successfully, but in the 60s and again in some in the 90s. And so I think that what the left hasn't had for quite a while is a narrative that's had broad enough appeal to bring in folks who aren't either elitist or minoritized. So I think that's another thing that's absolutely desperate, because I think factual information, the truth, as powerful as it is, if it isn't framed by a story that compels us, is not politically effective.
Good. Thank you, Dave. And the things I'm thinking about, I'm sorry, as I think about what I'm going to speak with you about next, the tremendous success of the COVID poverty relief programs. And these are programs that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden get to claim some credit for. They each engineered packages and got those packages through Congress. And I would point out to you that the level of unemployment in the early phases of the pandemic is hard to get your head around, right? It really is Great Depression levels of job loss, not Great Recession. It dwarfs the Great Recession. And I then add, by the way, almost no one felt so I shouldn't say almost no one, that's too strong, but the actual economic of impact of the pandemic was muted, was actually tremendously relieved by the legislation that Biden and Trump passed. And the result is that basically we came out of one of the steepest craters of job losses in modern history, economically intact. And so how do we tell that story? Right. And I want to tell that story in a way that says, although Trump did some, Biden did more, and Biden really should be given credit for getting us through the real danger of the pandemic downturn and focusing his administration on protecting the most vulnerable and then on creating jobs. How do we tell that narrative in a way that is actually compelling in the age of digital media? And I do agree with you, David, that there was a long period here, and in which the left succeeded in constructing powerful narratives. And on the other hand, I have to say that we are struggling to do this in the 21st century. And the part of the reason we're struggling to do it in the 21st century is that, we elect a Barack Obama, we elect a Joe Biden, they pass the Affordable Care Act, they pass the Inflation Reduction Act, and most Americans find that at the end of the day, their situation is not much better off than they thought it was at the beginning. Right. And that's not because those legislative accomplishments have not done tremendous good for the people who are their beneficiaries, but because the social forces that are generating inequality and precariousness are not directly addressed by that legislation. They continue to pull down and undermine so many people's sense of security, belonging, dignity, and agency. And in those circumstances, conspiracy theories that say there are bad people in charge and they're going to get you, and you need a savior who understands this and can fight them, the conditions are ripe for the success of that narrative, as opposed to the narrative that says, let's use experts and government and public policy to make things better for you. We've tried that. Maybe things are not as bad as they would have been, but they don't feel like they're getting better. They feel like they're getting worse. And so it seems to me that there's a social and political backdrop to all of this that makes it hard to use the old narratives. FDR to Johnson had a compelling framework, in part because government was actually working in concert with the economy to make life better for many Americans. It doesn't feel that way in 2024. People angry and agree, and Donald Trump is very good at tapping into that feeling structure. And go ahead. You're going to have to unmute.
Got it. I think one thing that needs to be added is that all of these things that we got through the pandemic and things were really taken care of very well, and many people survived because of it, but they're not being allowed to accept that because they're being told by Donald Trump that they're still in terrible shape.
Yeah, and it's hard to know what to do when reality seems to point in one direction and narrative points in another direction, right? And so I come back to crime on this, right? That Americans tend to believe, and then it depends where you are and when the question is asked, but that there's something like 4 to 6 times the amount of violent crime in their area than there actually is, right? We vastly exaggerate our crime rate and our susceptibility, our vulnerability, right? And so why is that? Why is it that we're so confused? And by the way, many other societies are not nearly as confused about the crime rate, right? And part of it does seem to be what our media dwells on, but part of it does seem to be the sense that we live in a less orderly, less trusting, less communal society than we used to. So it feels like the kind of society where people are less trustworthy, less cooperative, less likely to help you, more likely to prey on you or victimize you. And it worries me that we are susceptible to narratives that confirm what I'm calling feeling structures, some underlying sensibility that things are not right, and that we're not trying to get to the bottom of why we feel things are not right, because the explanations are complicated and don't identify clearly targeted others to blame. In those circumstances, again, we tend to fall prey to these alternative narratives. I know I'm circling around the same idea again, but I'm inclined to think that that's what I would say in response to that as well, Anne. Anybody else with a question or a thought for today? Flossie, you got another one. I'll let you conclude. Go ahead. But you got to unmute again. Can't hear you. Are you pushing down the space bar?
I am saying a child will lead the way.
Hmm.
I'm going back a bit, a long way. Happy New Year.
All right. Well, there's an enigmatic but possibly hopeful thought. Yes, I hope your New Year's are off to wonderful starts, and I'll take us back to the announced topics for the coming week. Take care, everyone. Be well, and see you next Saturday. Bye, bye, guys. Thanks.